Once, obviously, fascism was over with in the Second World War, the thing is you could not get rid of the shadow of fascism that easily, especially because of the massive size of some of the architectural commissions. And I'm showing you the train station in Milan, which Mussolini took over in 1931 in terms of its construction. It was a long-running construction from 1906 to 1931. It's an impressive building, but it is huge. It is massive. I mean, it's almost frightening to walk into because it does cast this rather long shadow of its past, plus just its sheer monumentality is quite frightening. And it is a shadow that you just couldn't get rid of in terms of Italian culture, and it was a frustrating one, especially in major industrial centers like Milan, which is where the Arte Povera are going to come out of. It's principally Milan and Turin, with a few artists that are going to be based in Rome, but Turin and Milan are going to be the two largest centers. In fact, they just finished almost a 100 million euro refurbishing of this building, which is quite odd as well. But
does Arte Povera mean anything? Arte Povera?
Well, it derives from the a group led by Kosinski, Jerzy Kosinski, right? No, wait a minute, I'm confusing the novelist. But there was a movement, a theater movement called poor art.
Poor.
Yeah, but the poor isn't meant in terms of cheap, bad materials. It's more of a term that's directed towards a simplification of artistic means of expression. And they always had to battle it because people thought it's just cheap art in a way, or you just use discarded material, but it's not. It's more of an intellectual and highly conceptual, even though it doesn't appear that conceptual sort of movement. So anyway, the shadow of fascism is going to be huge in this context, and it's going to survive in terms of the famous project, which was meant for the Roman exposition, as this indicates, in which you have some of those monuments surviving, which is a suburb of Rome now, which was meant to be the celebration of fascist Italy. It was never completed because the war obviously started, and which continued to be referenced in terms of Italian cinema. I mean, Michelangelo Antonioni's The Eclipse is set in this rather barren, still thriving though, but barren, fascist reminder and a metaphor as a sort of element of soullessness, which is tied into the relationship of couples within this particular movie. And it continued to be referenced into the early 70s. I mean, Pasolini's controversial 120 Days of Solomon is essentially an indictment of fascism set within Enlightenment philosophy, but specifically Marquis de Sade. So, I mean, that shadow, like I said, is going to be very, very long for the Italians. It's something that they're going to try as desperately as possible to move away from. And in that movement away, they were seeking, because, I mean, for the Arte Povera and a number of the sort of contemporary artists coming out of the Second World War, were attempting to find a link with the past, but a link with the past that wasn't embedded within a neoclassical type of tradition of the Renaissance and of Rome, because there was a view that had become corrupted by the hand of Mussolini and the Italian fascists. So the alternative came in terms of the Baroque, as I'll sort of point out. And it's an alternative that's going to be proposed both by artists as well as intellectuals working in Italy at this time. And one of the other interesting aspect about these intellectuals in Italy in the 50s and 60s was their involvement within the artistic community. There's a very strong sense of community between the artists and the academics working at this moment in time. And Umberto Eco is one of these seminal figures who comes out with the open work in 1962, where in the Poetics of the Open Work, the initial essay in that collection of works, essentially argues that the notion of the open work is essentially born during the Baroque, during the 17th century. And it's a position that's going to be picked up by a number of Italian scholars as well. And so, he doesn't make the argument that, the notion of the open work is that artists working in the 20th century quite consciously leave the certain parameters free for the viewer to enter into the work, and through the viewer's own performance of the work, can modify it, can transform it, can somewhat make it their own without losing, the initial sort of authorship of that particular work. And he really sees the Baroque as the first moment of sort of hinting towards this type of development, which he will feel will culminate in the work of artists working in the 50s and 60s. I always love Eco, and this is the sense of community, because Eco recounts in a wonderful catalog on Italian art published by the Guggenheim that he went to a performance of Piero Manzoni, where Manzoni was signing people as art, works of art, and provided you a certificate of, whether you wanted your arm signed or your leg sign, or your whole body to be an artwork, whether you want it in perpetuity or just for the day, and you had to pay, and you'd get a certificate for this. And Eco relates how he went to this performance, had his arm signed, and didn't wash it for 2 weeks. I mean, you think academics are immune to this type of idol worshipping, but Eco was just so enraptured by Manzoni's idea of this sort of really a non-transformative gesture, because obviously he doesn't change anything, he simply adds his signature to it. This is a stage performance with some female models that he hired for this particular show. Now the other one is a number of important Baroque scholars at the time who were part of a revival of the Baroque in Italy and Europe generally, because there is a good wealth of literature coming out in the late 40s, the 50s, and the 60s that are re-examining the Baroque. In part the French, for example, Jean Bousset and Gérard Genet, and the Italians with Dell'Arco, Maurizio Dell'Arco, who is not only a writer on the Baroque, an important scholar in the Baroque, but also a commentator on contemporary art as well, and continued well into, in fact, there's still some recent stuff of his from 2005 that I was reading, where he's looking at contemporary Italian art as well. And he published a book called Report of 1960, which was really looking at the contemporary art scene and examining it in part within the context of the Baroque. Noting on the one hand that he said that the contemporary artists no longer have this element of the universalism that the Baroque had, that it's sort of universal social relevance that he felt that the Baroque had at the time in the 17th century, had been lost. But that this didn't necessarily stop these artists from actually continuing and producing work that, although its impact would be less than what it was during the Baroque, was still touching on some important issues. That there were significant parallels, even though they didn't necessarily reach the social import that the Baroque had in terms of this work. And the other one is obviously the Paolo Portoghesi, who published this in 1966, an important reevaluation of the Roman Baroque. And but again, it's a rather interesting book because it's very much, and you probably know him as an architect now because he's working, but his examination of the historical Baroque is constantly making reference to the present. For example, at one point he says the dispute on the Baroque, which the current dispute that he's talking about is one of the most vital experiences of our own contemporary culture. So there's an identification of this revival of a sort of Baroque mentality, Baroque sensibility, which he's identifying. And I have another quote. He says that it's opening the way to a conception of artistic activity as open-ended, infinite research, not to be crystallized in the absolute or set apart from the course of historical development. And here he's making quite a nod to Umberto Eco in this idea of the sort of open-ended, infinite type of composition. And I'm always fond of the fact that Borges is in the background here as well. His library of metaphors just there. But anyway, and then another moment where, and just to give you a sense of that flavor of this book, the history of the Baroque is a testament to, quote, the battle between those who surrender to reality and those who wish to transform it, between those who wish to be actors and those who are content to be spectators in human theater. And then again, he's very much addressing this contemporary audience in this sense. So there is this very significant revival of the Baroque, and a revival of the Baroque that really seeks to contemporize some of the issues tied in with the historical 17th century European Baroque. And it's the same situation reading Jean Bousset's book as well as I was interested in the Gérard Genet, which is his Figures 1, which is a nice collection, as well as 2 and 3, but 1 particularly is a nice collection of essays, some of them dealing with the Baroque and others dealing with more contemporary writers, like people like Flaubert and Mallarmé. There's really this intention in terms of how that collection is organized and sort of cross-fertilization of some of these concepts and ideas.